In this lecture, we are going to explore what life was like in the city-states of Sumeria. So before we move into the history, let us take a broad survey of the stage on which this drama unfolded. So let's get an idea of the geography and the kinds of conditions and possibilities it created for this land and this people where the civilization would grow. So, Sumerian civilization, which is also called the Greater Mesopotamian civilization and later the Babylonian or even the Assyrian civilization, they all grew on this alluvial soil deposited by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in their lower courses. So, the core area of where the civilization grew is this 250-mile arc at the head of the Persian Gulf. So, just like Egypt or the civilization of the Nile is, well, the gift of the Nile, so the civilization of Sumeria and Mesopotamia and all those which follow are the creation of these two rivers. Now, just as important as the waters of the two rivers were the waters of the Persian Gulf. The settlement from where Sumerian civilization in a sense began, which is Eridu at the present day site of Abu Shahrain, was at the head of the Persian Gulf. And in ancient records of the civilization, it is mentioned as a city which was on the shore of the sea. Of course, present day Abu Shahrain is not on the shore of the sea, which gives us an idea that perhaps the waters of the Gulf extended much further up north. Or perhaps there were lakes which sort of seeped in fresh water into this region, because the region is also mentioned as a region where the fresh water from under the ground and the waters from the sea in a sense mingled to create this very interesting terrain where this site grew. The land and the terrain of any civilizational theater influences the form and the structure of the civilization, and also influences the psychology of the people who will choose to build their civilization there. And this geography influenced Sumerians to a great extent. So Eridu was founded sometime around 6000 BC, and the great cities of Sumeria would grow from around 3500 BC. But even then, people of these great cities, they remembered Eridu as their mother city, and they remembered the region around Eridu as a holy region from which their civilization had in a sense emerged. They built various myths around the region, myths around the god Enki, whose abode was in the fresh waters below Eridu and whose temple was based at Eridu. And later there was also this myth of some sea creatures or a species of divine beings which lived under the water and who came on land near the site of Eridu and gave the ancestors of the Sumerian people the gifts of civilization. These gifts of civilization were an important part of Sumerian culture, and they were collectively called the May and also the Namtar in various traditions. The other great founding myth, in a sense, of Sumerian civilization was the myth of the Great Flood. So the Sumerians believed that their ancestors had created a civilization which had lasted for millennia and which had reached a very high level of technological development. But at a certain stage, everything was destroyed by this Great Flood, which destroyed all civilization. And there were a few cities which survived this Great Flood and which continued even after the Great Flood and became seats of great power. So these were cities like Eridu, of course, and other great cities like Kish, Uruk, Ur, Adab, Larak, Separ, Shirupak, and several others that we will become more familiar with as this lecture progresses. Another city which is often included in this list is Mari. Now, Mari is situated much further north, and it was in a sense an outpost of Sumerian civilization in northern Mesopotamia. But based on recent excavations and some very important discoveries from Mari, including some documents, we understand that this was an important center of Sumerian civilization. Another important northern city founded on the Tigris River was the city of Ashur. Now, Ashur would become famous in the later history of Mesopotamia as the home city of the Assyrians. And initially it was thought that Ashur was a much later city than the older cities of Sumeria. But based on recent excavations, at the oldest layers of this settlement, we have found evidence of a temple dedicated to the Sumerian goddess Ishtar. So we conjecture that Ashur was perhaps founded as a Sumerian outpost in the north. Now, this is interesting because Ashur is, relatively speaking, quite far away from the central arc or the central core of Sumerian civilization. In fact, both Mari and Ashur are situated quite far from the homeland of the Sumerians. So there could have been colonies established further upland, but they present an intriguing puzzle. Another interesting site is Susa, which we know as an important city, perhaps even a capital of the Elamite civilization. Now, Susa, in its oldest layers, shows evidence of what is called the Proto Elamite culture. Then, subsequently, it shows more evidence of Sumerian influence. Now, initially, this presented a puzzle to archaeologists, but now we are mostly certain that Susa was influenced by Sumerian culture during this phase of expansion of cities in the Sumerian core, known as the Uruk expansion. So initially, Susa was established as an Elamite or a proto-Elamite settlement, and it was later subsumed into this Sumerian culture. Now, perhaps this was also the case with Mari and Assur. Now, this is important because the layering of culture and the expansion and contraction of culture that we can observe through different cultural patterns on different archaeological layers gives us a very important insight into which cultures were influential and how far their influence spread during different times, especially during the prehistoric period. And when we enter the historic period, which actually begins from around 3000 BC in Sumeria, then we can correlate this archaeological evidence with textual evidence, and this gives us very solid basis for building a map of the history of this region. So now we know for a fact that even Sumerian culture, what we call Sumerian civilization, was a coming together and an emergence of a civilizational phase, which was built on the foundation of many cultures which had existed before. So it is not surprising that even the Sumerians, once they began to expand, were able to attract or assimilate other cultures into themselves. And during their phases of contraction, sometimes those cultures which had been assimilated long ago would break away and perhaps establish their own cores from which they would dominate other cultures, and sometimes even the old home culture from which, of course, they had broken away. So in the 4th millennium BC, there is no doubt that this civilization was a civilization of Sumerians, and that is what these people called themselves, who spoke a common language, had common fashions in dress, in food, and various other things, and most importantly, who worshipped the same gods. And there was a clear distinction in this civilizational realm between insiders who belonged to the civilization and the outsiders. And the outsiders, in most cases, in the early stages of the civilization, were people who were identified as the Amorites. Now, the Amorites have been identified as this umbrella group of pastoralists who inhabit the steppes, in a sense, and the plains to the west of the Sumerian core. The distinction again is not so much of language, because some Amorites might have spoken Sumerian languages and some ancestors of Sumerians might have spoken Amorite languages. But the distinction is one of ways of life. And that is made clear by an epic poem which was written during the time of a king called Lugal Banda. Now, in earlier lectures, we have discussed the symbiotic relationship between settled domus culture people and roving pastoralists or nomadic people, whom we call the Ordos people. So, as we also discussed in the previous lecture, in this world system within which the Sumerian civilization emerged, a symbiotic relationship had developed between settled people and these moving nomadic people, especially for facilitating trade and exchange. So, in some sense, these nomadic people were essential for the life or for the affluence and prosperity of the settled people, but there were also people who occupied these edges of civilized life, in a sense, and were constant irritants, and people with whom these settled people often went to war, or vice versa. So during the time of Lugal Banda, relations between the Amorites and the Sumerians had broken down, and Lugal Banda had expelled all the Amorites from his cities. So the most important thing that held the Sumerian civilization together was this clear conception of this order of the world based on their mythology. The gods of Sumeria were this gravitational center around which all of Sumerian life revolved. So, according to Sumerian cosmography, in the beginning there was nothing. Well, there was a watery waste in which two primordial gods emerged. These gods had very vague names. So, one was called All That Is Above, and the other was called All That Is Below. So, from the successive generations of these gods, more distinctive personalities emerged, especially Enki was a god of wisdom and who, of course, like I mentioned before, gave the gifts of civilization to mankind and allowed them to build these cultures which would, of course, worship these gods. That is what cultures are built for. And so mankind was created to serve these gods, who, in addition to Enki, were Anu, Enlil, Ishtar, who was also known as Inanna, and various others. Because these gods needed certain sites where they would be worshipped, so cities were created, cities such as Eridu, Bat Tibara, Larak, Sipar, and Shirupak, and later newer cities such as Nippur, Uruk, and Babylon itself were also dedicated to various gods. So cities, in a sense, belonged to these gods, were built for these gods. They were assigned to these gods, and in a sense, they functioned for these gods. All these gifts of civilization were given to human beings by the gods. So there was, in a sense, a divine contract. The gods gave civilization to human beings, and human beings in turn served these gods by making sure and ensuring that civilization, the machinery of civilization, functioned as the gods had ordained. So, gods, in a sense, are the center or at the apex of this hierarchy or this great chain of being. So, this is the great plan through which Sumerian civilization is built. The gods above all, and below the gods, there must be some kind of a representative of the gods on earth, or a manager who ensures that the world functions according to the way the gods have created it. In this divine myth, or what we call myth, which was a reality for the Sumerians, we find the roots of the structure of kingship or hierarchy which would come to be in Sumerian civilization. So the gods themselves were structured and organized into a hierarchy. They had a king whom they elected, and the king of the gods was Anu. Anu, who was the bearer of the scepter, the crown, the tiara, and the shepherd's crook, which were the signs of Anu. And Anu bestowed these symbols upon his representative on earth, who became the managers of Anu's will. So kingship then descended from the heavens, and it resided in these cities which were built for the gods, and each god had his own city, and some cities were, of course, dedicated to multiple gods. There were these complexities of power. And in these cities, there were sites where the managers or the foremen of the gods reigned. Now, this idea of divine order is slightly more complex than it initially seems. Now, remember, there are various gods and multiple gods who are all emergent from these primordial gods from the Apsu. So, these gods, initially, when they came into being, were in a sense equal. But gradually, one from among them was raised to become the king of the gods. So, how does this divine order reflect on earth? Remember, all the gods have a city assigned to them on earth in Sumeria. So, all these cities, in a sense, are equal, but through some structure of competition, through some way of determining who is the most powerful among them, one city can become powerful and greater than all the other cities, just like one god has become more powerful and greater than all the gods. And in this logic, we see the emerging geopolitical structure of the city-states of Mesopotamia. So, just like one god could have power over all the other gods, in the heavens, a representative of the gods on earth could have power over other representatives. And since the seat of these representatives was in various cities, this meant that the ruler of one city could have power over rulers of all the other cities of Mesopotamia. So this is the geopolitical structure of the Sumerian civilization, which will endure for over a millennia.